Before we start, I need you to forget everything you think you know about this city, because what you are about to see has nothing to do with the New York in your head. In 1880, New York City had over 150,000 horses working its streets every single day. Every single one of them was dumping waste directly onto the road every single hour. Historians have done the math. They've calculated exactly what that meant. 500 tons of manure every day on the streets of the most advanced city in the world. And that is not even the worst part. Each horse also produced roughly a quart of urine daily. Across 150,000 animals, that was 40,000 gallons of urine, also on the streets, also every single day. The smell hit visitors miles before they arrived by boat. Journalists who came to cover the city described it as a physical force, something you walked into rather than simply noticed. A warm, suffocating wall of rot that coated everything: your clothes, your lungs, the inside of your mouth. This was 1880s New York. Not the romantic gas-lit city of the movies, not the elegant brownstones of television dramas, not the gleaming bridge you have seen in 1,000 photographs. The real thing. In this video, we used artificial intelligence to reconstruct exactly what this city looked like: the streets, the people, the impossible daily reality of survival in the most overcrowded place in human history. What you are about to see will permanently change how you picture America's greatest city. Let's go back. Forget everything you think a city looks like. In 1880, Manhattan had no paved roads outside of the wealthiest neighborhoods. What it had instead was mud, thick, black, ankle-deep mud churned every day by the wheels of thousands of wagons and the hooves of those 150,000 horses. The horses were everywhere. They pulled the streetcars. They delivered the goods. They carried the wealthy to their appointments. And every single one of them produced waste directly onto the streets every hour of every day. And when a horse died, which happened constantly, given the brutal pace of work and the indifference of the men who owned them, the carcass was simply left where it fell. The city had no efficient removal system. A dead horse might lie in the middle of a Manhattan street for 3 days, sometimes a week. Children played around them. Pedestrians walked around them. Life went on around them. In 1880 alone, the city removed 15,000 dead horse carcasses from its streets. That is more than 40 dead horses every single day. The sidewalks were wooden planks, rotting and collapsing underfoot. Most streets outside the wealthy districts had no lighting at all. Gas lamps existed, but only where the city could afford them, which was never where the poor lived. After dark, entire neighborhoods descended into near total blackness, and in that darkness, the city became genuinely dangerous. Police refused to enter certain neighborhoods after nightfall, not because they were cautious, because they were afraid. The gangs that controlled those dark streets had been operating for decades. They had their own laws, their own territories, their own brutal methods of enforcement that made the official police look not just irrelevant but almost quaint by comparison. 17 years before our story begins, those gangs had helped turn this city into a war zone for 5 days straight. 119 confirmed dead in the streets. We will come back to that. But first, let me show you who was actually living here, because you cannot understand this city without understanding the people who built it. In 1880, New York City was the most densely populated place on the face of the earth. Over 1 million people crammed onto the island of Manhattan, most of them concentrated in a strip of the Lower East Side less than 2 miles long. Historians have calculated that at its peak, this neighborhood reached a density never recorded anywhere in human history. More crowded than the worst slums of Calcutta, more crowded than Victorian London's most desperate districts. They came from everywhere. Irish families still carrying the grief of the famine, Jewish families fleeing pogroms and persecution across Eastern Europe, Italian immigrants leaving a poverty so extreme that crossing an ocean in a ship's hold, sleeping in shifts, eating almost nothing for weeks seemed like the better option. German, Polish, Hungarian, Greek families, all of them pouring through Castle Garden, the immigration processing center at the southern tip of Manhattan. Between 1855 and 1890, over 8 million people walked through those gates. 2 out of every 3 immigrants entering America came through that single building. They had been told stories of streets paved with gold, stories of a land where work was plentiful and opportunity was limitless, where a man could arrive with nothing and build something real, where his children would have a future that he himself could only dream of. What they found instead was the Lower East Side of 1880s New York, and most of them never left it. Labor contractors waited at the docks before the ships had even docked, signing desperate men into low-wage work before they had found somewhere to sleep, before they had eaten a meal on solid ground. Landlords charged rents so high that families were forced to take in strangers, boarders, sleeping in shifts in the same bed just to survive the month. And in 1882, right in the middle of this wave of desperate arrivals, the United States government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first and only law in American history to bar an entire nationality from entering the country. The men who had broken their backs building the Transcontinental Railroad, who had carved tunnels through mountains with their hands, were now legally prohibited from becoming citizens of the country they had helped connect. Think about that for a moment. They built the country, and then the country locked the door. Children went to work immediately. Not at 12, not at 10. At 6 years old, children in the tenements of the Lower East Side were already working. In garment sweatshops, tiny airless rooms packed with sewing machines, windows nailed shut to keep the thread from blowing, working 14-hour days in temperatures that in summer became genuinely dangerous. In coal cellars, in match factories where the phosphorus slowly rotted their jawbones from the inside, they were paid pennies. And then there were the ones with no parents at all, the newsboys. Thousands of orphaned and abandoned children roamed the streets of 1880s, Manhattan selling newspapers, the only work available to a child with no family and no address. They slept in doorways, under bridges, in newspaper printing houses on cold nights when the pressmen took pity on them. Some were as young as 6 years old, standing on a corner in January, in the dark, holding papers, hoping someone would stop. These children would eventually do something that stunned the city. In 1899, the Newsboys of New York organized one of the first successful child labor strikes in American history. They refused to sell papers for 2 weeks straight. They held the line, and they forced the major publishers to meet their demands. They won, but that is 1,899 in 1880. They were just trying to survive the night. The life expectancy in these neighborhoods for everyone, adults and children alike, was under 40 years old. Not because they were weak, because the conditions they lived in were designed to kill them. Let me show you where they slept. A typical tenement apartment on the Lower East Side was 1 room, sometimes 2, if the family was fortunate enough to afford it. No windows, the buildings were packed so tightly together that interior rooms received no natural light whatsoever, no ventilation. In summer, the temperatures inside reached levels that caused heat stroke and killed infants. In winter, the cold came through the walls as if the building simply wasn't there. One building on Orchard Street housed 101 people across 14 apartments. Let me repeat that. 101 people. One building, 14 apartments, an average of 7 people per room, in rooms the size of a modern bathroom, no running water, no indoor plumbing of any kind. An entire building of 50, sometimes 100 people shared a single outdoor privy in the courtyard below. In winter, reaching it meant crossing an open yard in temperatures that could kill. In summer, the smell from the overflowing waste pit rose through every floor of the building, continuously mixing with the horse waste rising from the street below, until the building itself seemed to sweat with it. Water came from street pumps, and those pumps were frequently contaminated. Cholera swept through the tenement districts with terrifying regularity. Typhoid was endemic. Tuberculosis, called consumption at the time, killed thousands every year. Here is what that actually looked like inside one of these buildings. A family would notice one member beginning to cough, a persistent, wet, rattling cough that did not improve. Within weeks, it would spread to the next person in the room, then the next. There was no way to isolate the sick from the well. There was literally no other room to move them to. The family would watch each other deteriorate in the same space where they slept, ate, cooked, and worked, with no medical care available and nowhere else to go, even if someone had told them where to turn. Entire buildings infected. Entire blocks. And here is the detail that makes all of this feel even more suffocating. The landlords who owned these buildings were often not faceless corporations in distant offices. They were frequently the slightly more successful immigrants from the same communities, men who had arrived a decade earlier, scraped together enough to buy a building, and now extracted maximum rent from the people who came after them. Exploitation did not require distance. Sometimes it lived one floor up. The tenants had no legal protections. Lease agreements were verbal. Eviction could happen in days. Complaining about conditions meant looking for somewhere else, and there was nowhere else that cost any less. They were trapped, not by bars or chains, but by the mathematics of survival. And then, in 1890, a journalist named Jacob Riis walked into these buildings with a camera and a magnesium flash gun, the only technology that could photograph in near total darkness, and documented exactly what he found. His book, How the Other Half Lives, was published that year. It contained photographs that had never been seen before, not illustrations, not drawings made by comfortable artists imagining poverty from a safe distance, actual photographs of actual people, in actual rooms, 10 minutes from City Hall. Politicians who had spent their entire careers in this city claimed they had no idea. They had no idea because they had never looked. The people dying in those rooms had been invisible to the city that depended on their labor, to the politicians who controlled their lives, to the wealthy families on Fifth Avenue, who wore the clothes they sewed and ate the food they delivered, until Riis pointed his camera at them and said, "Look." Now the question became, what would the people with power actually do about it? The answer, as it so often is, was very little, very slowly, after a great deal of profit had already been extracted. Let me show you why. Now I need you to hold that image in your mind. The tenement room, the family of 7 crammed into a space smaller than your kitchen. The contaminated water pump, the children going to the sweatshop before they were old enough to read. Hold that image, and now look 10 minutes north. Fifth Avenue in the 1880s was one of the most spectacular streets in the world. The Vanderbilts had built a mansion so large it occupied an entire city block. When it was eventually expanded in the 1890s, it would reach 137 rooms, 37 bedrooms, 16 bathrooms, a grand dining room that doubled as a private art gallery, and a Louis XIV ballroom that could hold over 1,000 guests. The exterior was carved limestone. The interior was paneled in wood imported from the finest forests in Europe and hung with paintings purchased from the greatest private collections on the continent. The Astors lived nearby, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the men who had built their fortunes directly or indirectly on the labor of the people dying in the tenements 10 minutes south of their dinner tables. The contrast was not incidental. It was not an accident. It was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. This was the Gilded Age, the term Mark Twain coined for an era that glittered on the surface and rotted underneath. The wealth being generated in New York in the 1880s was almost incomprehensible. The city was becoming the financial capital of the world. The money flowed through Manhattan in quantities that had no historical precedent. None of it reached the people making it possible, and the political machine existed specifically to ensure that it never would. Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party machine that controlled New York City for most of the 19th century, had perfected a system of organized corruption so complete it was almost elegant. Politicians bought the votes of the poor with coal deliveries in winter and food baskets at Christmas. In return, those politicians awarded city contracts to their allies, took cuts from every business operating in their districts, and ensured that the police hired through Tammany protected the interests of those who paid them rather than those who needed them. The police in 1880s New York were, by any modern standard, a criminal organization with badges. Patrolmen paid their precinct captains for the privilege of their positions. Precinct captains paid the politicians above them. In return, they were permitted to take money from every brothel, gambling den, and criminal gang operating in their territory. The poor paid twice, once in the taxes that funded the police, once in the money the police extracted from anyone running any kind of informal business just to survive. The immigrants in the tenements, the children in the sweatshops, the newsboys sleeping under bridges, the families watching each other die of tuberculosis in a single room, all of them invisible, all of them paying for a system that existed to serve everyone except them. Jacob Riis had shown the world what was happening in those rooms. He had held up the mirror. But while politicians debated and delayed and protected their investments, the city itself was being transformed, not by the powerful, by the builders. And what they were building right in the middle of all this chaos was something that had never existed before in human history. While the tenements were killing people on the Lower East Side, 3 miles north, a man named Washington Roebling was lying in his bedroom, unable to leave. He was directing the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge through a telescope from his window. Roebling had taken over the project from his father, John, who died from a construction accident before a single cable had been hung. Washington himself had been struck down by caisson disease, severe decompression sickness from working in the pressurized underwater foundations that left him partially incapacitated for the rest of his life. He spent years watching through that telescope, sending instructions through his wife Emily, who had taught herself structural engineering and bridge mathematics, and became one of the most important engineers on the project despite receiving none of the formal credit. There is something quietly devastating about that image. The man who could not leave his room, the woman carrying his instructions across the city every day for 11 years, the bridge going up wire by wire, stone by stone, while the people who built it suffered in ways the history books would mostly ignore. 27 workers died during construction, crushed by falling stone, killed by snapping cables, drowned, taken by the bends. 14 years of building. On May 24th, 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge opened to the public. It was the longest suspension bridge in the world, the tallest structure in the Western Hemisphere. People came from across the country just to walk across it, to stand at the highest point above the East River and look at the city spreading out in every direction below them. 1 million people below. The harbor beyond, the continent stretching west toward everything that had been promised. At the same time, the elevated railways, the L, ran above the streets on iron frames, carrying passengers across Manhattan at speeds no horse could match. But the poor neighborhoods always paid the price for progress. The noise beneath the L tracks was so constant and overwhelming that normal conversation was impossible. Property values on blocks directly below documented as 20% lower than 1 block away because nobody with a choice lived under the permanent roar of iron wheels on iron rails. The rain of oil dripping from the mechanisms above, the occasional shower of hot sparks falling onto pedestrians below. The wealthy neighborhoods got the quiet, the poor neighborhoods got the L. And on September 4th, 1882, Thomas Edison switched on the first commercial electrical system in America at Pearl Street Station in Lower Manhattan. The station served around 85 customers on that first day, powering 400 lamps across a handful of blocks in Lower Manhattan. Within a month, 59 customers. Within 2 years, over 500. The gas lamps were beginning to disappear, one by one, replaced by something that felt almost like a miracle to the people who saw it for the first time. The city was being born in real time, and the people in the tenements, the million souls in the most overcrowded neighborhood in human history, were watching a modern world being built around them, a world they had helped build. A world they were not yet being allowed to live in. Now let's talk about what happened after dark. Because 1880s New York was, by any measure, a place where violence was not an exception. It was the weather, it was the air, it was simply the condition of life in the lower city after nightfall. Historical analysis of homicide records places the murder rate in 1880s Manhattan at several times what it is today. And to understand why, you need to understand what this city was still carrying. Just 17 years before our story begins in July of 1863, New York had erupted into 5 days of the worst civil violence in American history outside of the war itself, the draft riots. Working-class men, predominantly Irish immigrants, furious at being conscripted into a war they could not afford to buy their way out of. The exemption fee was $300, roughly a full year's wages for a laborer, turned their rage on the people they had been told to blame, the black community of Manhattan. 119 people confirmed killed, thousands more injured, thousands of black residents driven permanently from their homes. The Colored Orphan Asylum, a home for black children, burned to the ground while the mob cheered. The National Guard was pulled from Gettysburg, where they had just fought 3 days earlier, to be deployed on the streets of New York City. The wounds from those 5 days had never fully healed. The racial terror, the neighborhood scars, the deep distrust of authority, all of it still present in 1880, woven into the fabric of every block in Lower Manhattan. And into that still smoldering landscape stepped the gangs, not in the romantic way that movies depict, not theatrical rumbles and switchblades and choreographed violence. Real gang control in 1880s, Manhattan was systematic, territorial, and completely embedded in the daily life of the neighborhoods. The YOs operating throughout Lower Manhattan ran what was essentially a criminal services business. When a member named Piker Ryan was arrested in 1884, police found a printed price list in his coat pocket. A punch to the face, $2, 2 black eyes, $4, breaking a nose and jaw, $10, breaking an arm or leg, $19, murder, which the list referred to as doing the big job, $100. These were not desperate acts of poverty. This was organized commerce, with pricing, with repeat customers, with a professional pride that is genuinely disturbing to read about even now. 5 Points, the intersection that gave the neighborhood its name, on what is now the Foley Square area of Lower Manhattan, where the federal courthouse stands today, was considered the most dangerous neighborhood in the world. Not in New York, not in America, in the world. Visitors came specifically to witness it, escorted by police officers who refused to enter certain blocks, even in pairs. Charles Dickens visited during an American tour and wrote about it with undisguised horror. He had seen poverty in London that made grown men weep. 5 points shook him. The National Guard was called into New York City streets multiple times throughout the 1880s. This was not a crisis. This was not an emergency. This was Tuesday. You have now seen what the postcards never showed you. Not the Brooklyn Bridge gleaming in the morning light. Not the elegant brownstones of a sanitized history. Not the romantic gas-lit streets of a television drama. The real 1880s New York. A city of 1 million people, most of them immigrants who had crossed an ocean on hope alone, crammed into the most overcrowded streets in human history, building America's greatest city with their hands and their bodies and their children's stolen childhoods. They lived in rooms with no windows and drank water that could kill them. They worked 14 hours a day and still could not pay the rent. They watched their children go to work before they were old enough to read, and they watched them come home in the dark and collapse onto a floor they shared with strangers. And they lay awake wondering if this was really it, if this was all the new world had been. They buried their neighbors from tuberculosis and cholera and violence and the sheer grinding weight of poverty. And then they got up the next morning and kept going, because stopping was not an option, because the children needed to eat, because somewhere underneath all the exhaustion and the darkness, a small flame still burned the idea that it could be different. That it would be different, that something they were building in this broken, beautiful, impossible city would eventually matter. And they were right. Out of all that suffering and corruption and poverty and darkness, the people who history forgot built the most important city in the world, not despite the chaos, because of what they refused to let the chaos take from them. These were real people, invisible to the history books, invisible to the politicians who lived 10 minutes away, invisible to the story that New York eventually told about itself when it got rich enough to have a story. But they were here, and now you have seen them. If history like this is what you are here for, the real story, underneath the legend, underneath the myth, then you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe, because we are just getting started.